Okay, sponsors A Year of Learning by Dr. Paul Koningsberg in memory of his brother, Dr. Sam Koningsberg, Shimon Reuven ben Lebush, and Ed Goldberg's cousin, Nissan Hara, Nissan ben Fardosa. Paula and Bob Bromberg in memory of their dear friend Julian Smith, Yehuda ben Yisrael. Malcolm Mann in memory of her family murdered in the Holocaust. Harav Tzvi Hirsch ben Shlomo Yaakov, Sarah Bas Ephraim, Yisrael David ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Ephraim ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Adia Bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Miriam Bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Pesel Bas Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shalom ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shlomo ben Yaakov ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch, Shmuel ben Harav Tzvi Hirsch. Many friends of Dr. Marvin Blush, Moshe Shalom ben Yitzchak Halevi, friends of Toby Paris, Saratova bat Yisrael Dov. Month of Learning, concluding today by Gary and Marcia Schrager in memory of his father, David ben Yosef, and his mother, Freda Bas Hendel. The Month of Learning by Dov Bodlander in memory of his father, Tzvi ben Yaakov Yitzchak, his mother, Bela Devasha Bas Harav Dov Ber, his father-in-law, Yehuda Tzvi ben David Nachum, and his mother-in-law, Alta Chaya Bas Avram Yosef. Also a Month of Learning by Mel and Haran Haller in memory of his father, Avram ben Ze'ev. A Week of Learning ending today by Judy Iger in memory of her son, Yerachmiel ben Aaron, as well as a Week of Learning ending today by Judy and Marty Engel in memory of her father, Chaim Yosef ben Alta Yaakov. On Shabbos, a Day of Learning plus Shalosh Shudas, sponsored by Bruce Deutsch in memory of his father, Yosef ben Leib. Also for Shabbos, a Day of Learning plus Torah Fund dedication, sponsored by David and Ann Klar in memory of his father, Yosef Yehuda ben David. Today, also a Day of Learning sponsored by Lillian Ziv in memory of her husband, Yosef ben Yaakov Shlomo. Okay, may the Shemas have an Aliyah, Krank, Rafia, Velti, Yashir, Shem, Atliya, and the Chol B'nai Yisrael, a good gebencht yar.
Amen.
Okay, all right, we were with reading, sort of still dealing with this story between what the Bereish Galuta had asked Rav Huna bar Chinana to do, okay, and how he set up a, I'll call it 2 rows of made for partitions using poles within the 3 tfachim so that levud would apply, enabling them to carry the food from the mansion of the Reish Galuta out into the arbor, into the what do you call it there? A pavilion that's in the area, okay, of the orchard, right? And then Rava came, removed those poles, because his opinion was that it would be permitted to carry in the entire orchard in any case. And his 2 students, Rav Papa and Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, went and collected the sticks so they couldn't be used again. Now, that's where we sort of left off, okay? And that later on, another generation's looking at this story, Ravina challenged Rava, okay, in regards to the fact that isn't that problematic what was done, okay? Because an old city, is one that was settled and later enclosed, but a new city is where it's settled and then enclosed afterwards. And isn't the orchard, okay, like it was enclosed and later settled, right? So if it was, all right, if that's the case, wouldn't that say then that it should have been done, right? That Rav Huna bar Chinana's opinion was correct. So Rav Pat, we're going to pick up now about 5 or 6 lines down. Actually, it's 7 lines down on Kaf Vav Amud Aleph, 26A1 in our scroll. Amarle Rav Papa the Rava. So Rav Papa now says to Rava, okay? Va'amar Rav Asi, mechitzot ad rachalim. Okay? Can't we say that since this was a enclosure around a residence, okay, the orchard was still part of the property of the Reish Galuta, okay? And ad rachalim here, according to Art Scroll, is construction workers, but according to Koren Steinsaltz, it's more like architects. Okay, lo shma mechitza is not considered a valid kind of partition. Alma kedivan de letzniuta avidala, since it was done for the purpose. Art Scroll gives concealment, but I don't like that. I think it's more
privacy?
for privacy, exactly.
Privacy.
All right, avidala lo havya mechitza. In other words, therefore, we can't really consider it, okay, a valid partition. Hachanami, here too, he's saying, Delitzniuta avidalo avya mechitza. Since the Reish Galuta had put it up initially, okay, for the purpose of privacy and not, let's say, for any other purpose, how can we consider this a valid mechitza to allow them to carry on Shabbat in the entire arbor, entire orchard? Okay? So now, what happens? Amar Rav Huna Berei the Rav Yoshua the Rabba. And he says to Rabba, okay, following, Va'amar Rav Huna, and did not Rav Huna himself say the following, right? Mechitza ha'asuya lenachat, if you have a partition that was made for, Art Scroll says storage, which is an acceptable translation. I like, in other words, storage, resting, in other words, only for temporary use. Okay, lo shma mechitza, it's not considered a valid partition. Daha Rabba bar avuha ma'arev la lekula mechuza, because don't we have an example? He says, where Rabba bar avuha made an eruv for the entire town of Mechoza, right? Why? Arsaita, because of the arsayata, the ditches that were in the neighborhoods, right? Arsiyata, mishum pera de beitore, right? Because the ditches divide up the area, right, from one neighborhood to another, because the ditches were used for produce, in other words, to be able to feed oxen. V'hapera de beitore kemechitza ha'asuya lenachadamya. And these produce that were put in these ditches for the oxen, it's only like a partition that is made for storage, okay, for temporary use. They're similar to that, okay? Kari alea, reish galuta. So now, given this difference of opinion between Rava and the Rav Huna bar Chinana, right? What did the Reish Galuta say? Right? Kari Alaihu Reish Galuta. He said, Chachamim Hema lahara ulhetiv lo yadau. He cites a pasuk where they are wise men to do evil, but to do good they have no knowledge. Okay. Personally, I felt that to be certainly wasn't a complimentary statement on the part of the Reish Galuta. And now, as we continue on to the next 26A2, middle of the Amud, we're going to come back to our Mishnah, okay? And said that, remember that Rabbi Eli said he had learned 3 different things, if I remember correctly from the Mishnah, that he had learned from Rabbi Eliezer, all right? So we come back to this. Amar Rabbi Eli, Shamati mi Rabbi Eliezer, va'afilu beit kur. Okay? Art Scroll gives us the full. Amar Rabbi Eli, Shamati mi Rabbi, right? I heard from Rabbi Eliezer that even if a karpaf is as large as a base kur, it's permitted to carry in it. Now, matnitin, the lo kechananya. This implies that our Mishnah is not according to excuse me, Hanania, right? The Tanya, who taught, as we have taught in the Braita, Hanania says, Va'afilu hi arba'in seya, right? Even if it is 40 seya, right? How? Right? Astartaya, like a royal court. Okay, right, like a large courtyard that royalty might have in front of their, right? Shel Melech, like, right? Even if it's like that you can't carry it. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ushnehem Mikra Echad Darshu. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, sorry, that the 2 of them darshaned the very same pasuk. Okay? Shneamar, as it says, Vayhi Yeshayahu lo yatsa el chatzer hatichona. Okay, that he did not go out into the middle courtyard. Okay, here the question is going to be, how do you define courtyard? How do you define city? Because the very next pasuk says, Kativ ha'ir, right? Vayhi, right? Kativ ha'ir. Ukarinin chatzer, mikan, listardatya shel melech. And we call the courtyard similar to the public courtyard. I don't know another term for it. Big empty area space before a mansion or a king, right? Shahayu ka'ayarot. And those areas in front of the king's mansion excuse me, could be as big as a whole city. Ka'ayarot beinoniot, right? Okay. So the Gemara asks, B'mai kemiflagei, what are they really disagreeing about? Mar savar ayarot beinoniot havyan beit kor. One master is the opinion that most mid-sized cities are equivalent in size on the average to a base core. Mar savar me'ah seah havyan. And other are not 40, arba'im seah. That's what the average city is, 40 seah, and not a base core. Now, Gemara wants to clarify the example from the Navi, the Yeshayahu, my bai hatam, and Ishayahu, what was he doing there? Okay. Amar Rabba bar Chana, this is a little digression, right? Amar Rabbi Yochanan, so in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Milamed shechalach Chizkiah. Okay, the text teaches us that Chizkiah was ill, v'halach Yeshayahu, and Yeshayahu went, right, to do, let's say, Bikur Cholim, right? V'hoshiv yeshiva al pitcho. And then to improve his health, he established a yeshiva at the doorway, at the gateway, so to speak, in the courtyard of the king. The implication being that by learning there, they would be zoche, and therefore help the king heal. Mikan l'talmid chacham shechala. From here we learn that when a sage is ill, Shemoshivin yeshiva al pitcho, that they established some sort of yeshiva near his door. Okay? Velav miltahi, says the Gemara. But that's not significant. That's not something really the case. Dilma ate le'igruye. Okay? Namely, perhaps he came instead by having the, right, Beit Satan, that by having the yeshiva there, that would anger the Satan, and so therefore that would make the person get ill all the more. So that explanation wasn't accepted. So instead, we get to another example that Rabbi Eli said that he also learned from Rabbi Eliezer. V'chein shamati himenu, a second case, anshe chatzer sheshachach echad v'lo iriv beito asur, where it says in the Mishnah that a person who is part of a courtyard, okay, lived with other people off the same courtyard, but he, for some reason, forgot to include himself in the Eruv Chatzerus of the other people. It's forbidden for him to carry. Right? So the question is, what does it mean per se? V'hatnan, but isn't it taught elsewhere in a Mishnah? Beito asur lahotzi ulahachnis lo ulahem. That elsewhere the Mishnah seems to be saying that it's forbidden to bring in and out, okay, for him and for others. In other words, our Mishnah seemed to say he's the only one that's prohibited to bring in and out, but other people could bring into his house or carry out of his house. Okay, but this Mishnah seems to say no, it applies to all of them. The implication being, if one, for whatever reason, doesn't participate, okay, in the Eruv, it has an impact on his neighbors, unless he gives up his prerogative, let's say, to be part of that, gives up his reshus, okay, to be part of that the community for that Shabbat. Amar Rav Huna, Berei Rav Yoshua, Amar Rav Sheshet. So he says as follows: Rav Huna in the name of Rav Yoshua, in the name of Rav Sheshet, lo kasha. It's not really problematic. Why is that the case as we go over to Amud Beis, right? Ha, the Rabbi Eliezer, Vaha Rabbanan. Rather we say that one here, in other words, okay, in the other Mishnah was the example of Rabbi Eliezer, and here, okay, the opinion of the other Mishnah, in other words, our Mishnah is like Rabbi Eliezer. The other case is the view of the rabbis, okay, that no one is permitted. Kashatim tselomar, okay, and if you want to investigate this, you might say as follows: the divrei Rabbi Eliezer, according to the view of Rabbi Eliezer, hamevatel reshut chatzero, one who gives up the, let's call it the rights, okay, in his courtyard, reshut beito beitel, the responsibility, the rights in terms of his house is also nullified. The Rabbanan, according to the rabbis, hamevatel reshut chatzero, one who gives up the rights of his courtyard, reshut beito lo bitel, the rights of his house is not nullified. Okay, so that would be the case that Rabbi Eliezer says, okay, for the person and others, there's no carrying, but for the rabbis, yes. Pshita, isn't that obvious? Okay, so now a further comment. Amar Rechava, says Rechava, Ana v'Rav Huna bar Chinina targimna. I and Rav Huna bar Chinina can explain it and interpret this in the following way. Lo nitzracha ela lechamsha shesharuin b'chatzer achad. It was only necessary to say this in a situation where you had 5 people living, let's say, off the same courtyard. Okay? V'shachach echad mehen v'lo irev. And one of them forgot and did not include in the Erev Chatzeros. L'divrei Rabbi Eliezer, according to the view of Rabbi Eliezer, keshehu mevatel rishuto, when he relinquishes his rights, okay, vis-a-vis the courtyard, ein sarich levatel lekol echad ve'echad. He does not have to relinquish those rights to each and every one of his neighbors, I'm going to say, okay? The Rabbanan, but according to the rabbis, keshehu mevatel rishuto, when he relinquishes his rights, okay, in the courtyard, tzarich levatel lekol echad ve'echad. He must relinquish those rights to each one of the individual neighbors. Okay. Now, that could be a valid explanation to give us another way of interpreting the difference in the two Mishnayos. Okay. Keman. So we now come back. On what basis can we use this interpretation? As la ha the Tanya. Okay. Right? On what basis can we say that this we have the following Braita following this? Right? Chamisha sheshurin bechatzer echad. The following Braita, where we have 5 that dwell off the same courtyard. V'shachach echad mehem v'lo irev, and one of them forgot and didn't include himself in Erev Chatzeros. Keshehu mevatel rishuto, when he relinquishes his rights. Ein sarich levatel rishut lekol echad ve'echad. One does not have to relinquish his rights to each one of his neighbors individually. Keman, according to whom? Ke Rabbi Eliezer, like the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Rav Kahana matne hachi. Rav Kahana taught it that way. Rav Tevyume matne hachi. However, Rav Tevyune is teaching this Braita in a different manner. Keman azla ha detanya. According to whom do we say that the following Braita is taught? Chamisha sheshruyim bechatzer echad. 5 who are dwelling within the same courtyard. V'shachach echad mehem v'lo irev. And one of them forgot and was not included, did not include himself really in the Erev Chatzeros. Keshehu mevatel rishuto, when he nullifies, okay, or relinquishes his rights. Eino tzarich levatel rishut lekol echad ve'echad. He does not have to relinquish his rights to each one individually. Keman, according to whom? Amar Rav Huna bar Yehuda, Amar Rav Sheshet, Keman ke Rabbi Eliezer. According to whom? It's according to Rabbi Eliezer.
Rabbi.
Yes.
Yeah, we're not talking about carrying within the home he's relinquishing. It's only from the home to the chutzner, right?
Correct. Okay. Exactly.
But when somebody shochach, why is he mevatel?
Okay. That's a good question, Marvin. The impression I got was that when he forgot, all right, in other words, according to Rabbi Eliezer, his view is, what if you don't participate in the Erev Chatzeros, okay, and you didn't acknowledge giving up your rights, then that sort of puts a squash on the Erev Chatzeros for everybody else. Okay? That would be the implication. Okay. The rabbis didn't hold that way.
No.
But probably, especially in an example of forgetting. All right?
Right.
You know? And remember, okay, and I'm going to sort of say this even though we're not into the subject yet. The person, to participate in an Erev Chatzeros, he must put a piece of food,
Right.
edible food, in with the others, okay? So that now the Chatzer becomes, I'll call it a unit of joint ownership.
Right. He becomes a partner in it.
A partner, right, okay? So we're going to get to that issue in the next parak, by
Right.
the way, as to what foods are viable and what foods are not viable to be included in an Erev Chatserus, but it's not just an Erev Chatserus, by the way. All right, so we're now going to pick up again. Amar le Rav Papa la Abaye, right? So Rav Papa now says to Abaye, the Rabbi Eliezer, according to the view of Rabbi Eliezer, I Amar lo mivatilna, if he says, I don't wish to relinquish my rights, ula Rabbanan, and according to the rabbis, I Amar mivatelna, if he says, I am willing to relinquish my rights, what is the law going to be? So the Gemara tells us, Tama de Rabbi Eliezer, the reasoning of Rabbi Eliezer, Mishum de Kasavar, Hamivatel Reshut Chatzero, Reshut Bato Batel. Because Rabbi Eliezer holds that one who relinquishes his rights in the courtyard also relinquishes his rights to his residence. Okay, the rights to his residence is nullified. Vahai Amar, and this one says, Ana lo mevatelna. And then he says, I don't relinquish the rights. So in other words, he's only giving up the rights to the Chatzer and not to his house, according to Rabbi Eliezer. O Dilma, or perhaps Ta'amad Rabbi Eliezer, Mishum debate below Chatzer, lo avide inshe de daire. Or perhaps we're going to say that Rabbi Eliezer holds from a different view, okay? That his reasoning is, okay, that it's a situation, excuse me, the bayit below Chatzer, that to have a residence without a courtyard, lo avide inshe, people don't usually do that de daire, as a way of habitation. In other words, you want to have a residence associated with a courtyard. Ki amar lo mivatelna, and when he says, I don't relinquish my rights, all right, lav kol kamine, all right, we say in that sense, he doesn't have, it's not valid words. He doesn't have the power to do so. Afal gav amar dairna, even though he says, I'm living there, lav klum kamar. It's as if he said nothing. Okay. Ula Rabbanan. Okay, so we're not completely sure then what Rabbi Eliezer's reasoning is. Now, flip side. Ula Rabbanan, and according to the rabbis, Amar mevatelna, if he says that I do relinquish the rights to my residence, what is it? Tama de Rabbanan, the reasoning of the rabbis, Mishum de Kasavre, who they are of the opinion, Hamevatel Reshut Chatzero, Reshut Beito Lo Batel, that one who may relinquish the rights to the courtyard, he is not necessarily relinquishing the rights to his residence. Vahai Amar Mevatelna, and that's why he says, I relinquish them. Okay? Oh, perhaps, so Dilma, Tama de Rabbanan, the reasoning of the rabbis, mishum delo avid inish the mesalek nafshe legamre mibayet v'chatzer. Okay, or perhaps the rabbi's reasoning is that a person will not remove himself, okay, completely from his residence as well as the courtyard. Okay, and what would happen? V'have ki orech legabayu. And then he would be more like simply like a guest, okay, among the other neighbors. V'hai ki amar mevatelna. And now, when that person says that I relinquish the rights to my house, right, residence, lav kol kamine kama.
Means nothing.
Again, it's not within his power. It's no words. It's nothing valid. Okay. Now, Amar le. So Abaye asks, the Rabbanan, according to the rabbis, Bain the Rabbanan, Bain the Rabbi Eliezer. Whether we're talking about the view of rabbis or the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Kevan the Gale Date Gale. Once he reveals his mind, in other words, once he makes his statement, okay, and reveals his intention, okay, it's revealed. Now, the final was a third item that Rabbi Eli said from Rabbi Eliezer. V'chein shamati mimenu sheyotzim ba'ar kavlin b'Pesach. And I also learned from him that one can use ar kavlin, which is we're going to see that in a second, all right? From maror, a bitter herb. My arkavlin, what is this arkavlin? Asks the Gemara. Amar Reish Lakish.
That's right.
Okay. Itzavta charoziata. Okay. It's a kind of fiber. Okay. Entwined vines is what Art Scroll says. Koren Steinsaltz says it is a kind of fiber that grows around the outside, the trunk of a palm tree, a date palm tree, and it has some small leaves, but its stem is very bitter, and therefore this fiber is such that could be used. Okay, but he said he never found somebody to support, right? And that's the case. Hadranalach osin pasim. Thus we finish that second parak of Eruvi. Okay, we're going to continue now with the Mishnah, the new Mishnah. Okay, all right, we've got to turn a couple of pages. Okay, and I hinted to you all that since we said that an Erev Chatzeros requires putting in food, right? That's the next topic that we're going to deal with, okay? Now, I want to just introduce it real quick by saying this doesn't apply only to an Erev Chatzeros, but it applies also to Shtufei Mabuot, to a number of Chatzeros that could be off the same Mabui, the same courtyard, but it also applies to Erev Tchumim as well, okay? So this is a significant enough topic to say what foods are viable and what foods are not to be included. Why? Because we're saying that this food symbolizes, excuse me, symbolizes that one is moving their Shabbos residence to that location. And as a result, it shows collective ownership, or it shows a joint ownership of an area that ordinarily would not be considered a Rishus HaYachid. But now that it's considered that one can move to that area for Shabbat. That's particularly significant for Erev Tchumim. Okay? Now, what we're going to get to is a variety of items. And as we go through the Mishnah, which is what we're going to cover in our time, I want us to understand that, again, the questions that the Gemara is going to ask initially is going to be literary questions on the structure of the Mishnah first, and then afterwards on the tochen, on the contents of the Mishnah. Okay? So we start off. Bachol, right? Bachol, okay? On all things, implying all kinds of foodstuffs, right? Ma'arvin, one can make an eruv, so that would apply to eruv chatzerot and eruv tchulin. Umishtatfin, okay, so that applies to shituf mebuot.
Right.
Okay, chutz min hamayim umin hamelech, with the exception of water or salt. Okay. Now, question we're going to have to deal with at some point is, why are water and salt excluded? Okay. Vahakol, okay, a second element, and all foodstuffs, nikach b'kesef ma'aser, can be purchased using ma'aser sheni money, right? Chutz min hamayim u'min hamelech, again, with the exception of water or salt. Okay. Next statement in our Mishnah. Hanoder min hamazon, one who takes a vow not to eat certain foods. Okay? Right? We know a Nazirite, for example, takes a vow not to eat certain foods, drink wine, eat grapes, things like that. So one may have taken a vow of another kind for food. Mutar b'melech u'b'mayim. Okay? He is permitted, okay, to have food, okay, with the right? So his vow applies to any other kind of foodstuffs, but it doesn't include water or salt. Okay, now, our next piece in our Mishnah goes on to clarify. We said, we've just indicated the following, that all foodstuffs are available, right? But what about if it's a situation, if it's a foodstuff that someone can't normally eat under certain circumstances? For example, ma'arvin l'nazir b'yayin, that it's permissible for a Nazirite to use wine as part of his eruv, despite the fact, despite the fact that he cannot drink it. Or let's take another example, Uli Yisrael betruma, okay? Or to an Israelite to use truma food, right? Truma is only designated for Kohanim. So again, it's not permitted for him, okay? But maybe from this part of the Mishnah, we can learn something, okay, that says ultimately, while it may not be a foodstuff directly permitted to that person, so long as it's permitted for somebody else, it's still considered a valid foodstuff and therefore usable for an eruv. But we'll see if we're going to, how we'll deal with that. Sumchus omer bechulin. Sumchus, however, disagrees with that statement and says that the Israelite cannot use truma, but can only use non-kodesh foods, ordinary non-truma foods. The Kohen, bebeit hapras. Not only that, he says, but we could even make a eruv for a Kohen in a field that is a beit hapras. Now remember, beit hapras is a field that might have a corpse buried in it? Or certainly the question is, were a corpse to have been buried in it and the corpse plowed, okay, could the bones be spread out over the area of the field? Rabbi Yehuda Omer, afilu bein hakfarot. You could even set up an eruv for a kohen among the tombstones, right? Mepnei sheyachol lachutz v'leilech le'echol. Why? It says because the kohen can make a partition and then go and eat, okay, his eruv. Right? And that's the end of the Mishnah. Okay? Now, I'm just going to have a start. This is the Gemara for tomorrow. It's a long Gemara, so I want us to, at least together, to start it a little bit, since we do have a few more minutes, okay? Gemara says, the Gemara, what's our issue? Our issue, I said at the outset, was literary, stylistic. Remember, it started the Mishnah with bakol, with all. Okay? And so this is bothersome. Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. He says, Ein lemidin min haklalot. We're not able to learn from these general rules. Va'afil b'makom shene'amar bo chutz. And even in a situation, excuse me, where it says a generalization and then gives exceptions. Why? Midika amar, as it says, afil b'makom shene'amar bo chutz. Even in a place where it says except, okay? Miklal de lav hachakai. Why? Because it does not refer to here in our Mishnah. So the Gemara asks then, okay, hechakai. So where does it refer? Hatam kai. There, elsewhere. Okay? In another Mishnah, okay, we have an example where it says as follows. Kol mitzvot aseh shehazman grama. All commandments where it is time fixed or time bound, anashim chayavim, men are obligated, v'nashim pturot, and women are exempt. Okay? V'shelo hazman grama, and where the time is not, where it's not time bound, echad nashim ve'echad anashim chayavim. The same for women, the same for men, they are both obligated to perform. Uklalahu, and this seems to be an absolute rule, right? The kol mitzvat aseh shazman grama nashim turot, that we seem to be saying that any time-bound mitzvah, women are exempt. Hare matzah, but what about the example of eating matzah? Simcha, or the example of v'samachta b'chagecha, that you have a requirement to be joyful on the holiday. V'hakel, or the example that the Torah requires women as well as men to gather to hear the Torah reading on Hakel. Right? The mitzvot aseh shezman gramahu v'nashim chayavot. Right? That these are time-bound obligations, and women are also obligated. V'chol mitzvat aseh shelo hazman grama nashim chayavot, and you say that all non-time-bound mitzvot, women are, right, obligated. Hare Talmud Torah. Okay, or what about Talmud Torah? Right, learning Torah. Piria Orivia. Or what about being fruitful and multiply? Right? Upidyan ben. And what about redemption of the firstborn? The mitzvat aseh, shelo hazman grama, that these are mitzvahs that are not time bound. Okay, right? What happens? However, nashim pturot, and women are exempt from these, right, mitzvot. El amar Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, so notice Rabbi Yochanan was the one who started us off on this, but rather Rabbi Yochanan says, Ein lemedin min haklalot. We are not able to learn from, right, specific categories of rules from general rules. Va'afilu b'makom shene'amar bo chutz, even in a place where the Mishnah cites exceptions. Amar Abaye, and so Abaye says, Ve'itema Rabbi Yirmiyah, and others say it was Rabbi Yirmiyah who says, okay, following, Af ana nami tanina. So we also have learned this. Od klal acher amru. There was another general principle in another Mishnah that we also learned. Okay? And this was in the following. Kol shenisa al gabe hazav, talking about a zav. Okay, we say anything that is carried on a zav, tameh, becomes ritually impure, right? The kol shehazav nisa alav, and anything, right, that the zav is carried on, tahor, is pure. Chutz min hara'ui lemishkav umoshav v'ha'adam, with the exception of anything that is viable for sitting or lying or on a person. Okay? V'tu leka, and no more, he says. Nothing else. Right? V'ha'ika merkav. Okay, but don't we have examples where of things that are that the zav can sit on or ride on? Okay. So the Gemara says the following: V'hai merkav hechidami. And if you're saying sitting on, riding on, like what? Idiativ alei hainu moshav. If he's on top of it, isn't that the same as sitting? Right? Amen hachi ka'amrina. This is what we're saying here. Ha ikagava de'uchafa. We have here the upper part of a saddle. Okay? We would call that today a pommel, Pommel, right?
Right.
Okay, Detanya, as taught elsewhere in a Braita, ha'okef tamei moshav v'hatafus tamei merkav. Okay, so it says here the okaf, all right, the saddle itself is tamei, can become tamei because he's sitting on it. V'hatafus, right, that which you hold on
to.
Right? Because usually when you would get on a horse, okay, I don't know how many of us have been horseback riding lately, okay, but you often put your foot in the stirrup, you hold on to the pommel in order to swing your leg, pull yourself up and swing your leg around, tamei merkav, and that becomes tamei through riding. Halashma mina ein lemedin min haklalot. And thus, we would learn from this that you cannot learn from general rules. Va'afilu b'makom shene'amar bo chutz, even from a place where it says, gives exceptions. Okay? Now, the Gemara is going to continue, all right, with one other example of Rabbi Yochanan's statement. Right? The following. right?
Ravina.
Amar Ravina, ve'itema Rav Nachman. Ravina says, and others says Rav Nachman, af ananami tanina. So we also have learned. B'chol ma'arvin u'mishtadfin. Okay, and we now come back to our text, our Mishnah. With all, you can make an eruv or a shituf, chutz min hamayim v'hamelach, with the exception of water and salt. V'tu leka and no more. V'ha'ika k'mihin u'pitriot. But what about truffles? And what about mushrooms? Right? Right? Ela shmamina. But rather we learn from this the following. Ein lemedin min haklalot va'afilu b'makom shenhamar bo chutz. We don't learn from general principles, okay, even where it lists exceptions. Okay, and I think that's where we're going to stop, all right, because you're going to get now to the next section of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah was then talking about foodstuffs that could be purchased from the Maaser Sheni money, okay, and it's going to start dealing with this example again of water and salt, all right? And then it's going to lead on to the next, to the end of the Amud, okay, which is going to deal with another kind of food stuff, okay? And the whole next Amud, the back Amud, is going to still deal with these kinds of questions, okay? All right, so I think that's where we'll stop, if that's okay with everybody, and wish everybody a good Shabbos. And
Thank you. Wish everyone a good
Very well.
Shabbos. You too, Rabbi. Be well.
Shabbos, Rabbi.
Take care, everybody.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Have a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Gotta move the first of this because we gotta go to. Zion. We gotta go to 8. No, that's over here. All right. Yep.
You could see yourself.
Yeah, fine.
Hello.
I didn't shut out yet. I didn't get off yet. Everybody else is gone.
Okay.
Let me get out. Leave.